Boldwood presents Diamond Geezer, written by Gillian Godden and read by David Monteith. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Special Delivery. The swarthy man on the moped rode into the middle of the rundown estate. Parking in the forecourt of the tower blocks that surrounded him, he looked at his mobile phone to double-check the time and address. Cameron had delivered here before, but tonight he had an uneasy feeling. It wasn't the regular order, and it had been a different voice making the call. But it was his last delivery of the night, and he couldn't wait to get away from here. Taking off his helmet and linking his arm through the strap, he took off his thick leather gloves and picked up the pizzas on the back of his bike. Shivering slightly, he looked around and pulled up the collar on his jacket to keep warm. It was no wonder people wanted their food delivered to their doors in this shitty weather. It was freezing and still damp from the rain. Looking up, he saw that the windows of the grim tower blocks were lit from inside. Usually he would see people on their balconies smoking and shouting to each other from one tower block to the next. But not tonight. It was midnight, and there wasn't a soul around. At least that gave him hope. At least no one would steal his moped. Passing the burnt-out cars, he walked to the lift and pressed the button. This place gave him the creeps, and the darkness didn't help. But his boss at the pizza shop had convinced him to go. When the lift failed to arrive, Cameron considered ringing the customer to come and pick up the pizzas from the forecourt. But considering what was buried in them, he thought better of it. If it wasn't for the money he was going to make tonight, he would have reconsidered walking the 12 flights of stone steps to get to his destination. The spicy smells from the pizzas made him feel hungry and reminded him that he hadn't eaten yet. Breathless from climbing the stairs, he knocked on the door. The porch light above the door was broken, and so was the neighbours. It was nothing unusual in this place. Slum City, some people called it. Personally, he'd seen better slums. This place was known for its violence and drug dealing. It surprised him that his Albanian boss wanted to take over this place and use it as his own turf. People like this always stuck together. They didn't want to do business with foreigners they didn't know. It was a known fact. When the door eventually opened, he was nearly blasted away by the sudden burst of music that greeted him. The customer who opened the door wasn't known to him, making Cameron's hackles rise even more, and a frown crossed his brow. But he was warmly greeted by a man wearing only a t-shirt and boxer shorts, which made him feel easier, and it sounded like there was a party in session, which was why they wanted the food and anything else he had hidden under the pizzas. Squinting slightly, he could only see the outline of the customer's features, especially his bushy beard, but, given the state of the customer's undress, he could only presume what kind of private party was going on. Hoping to make himself understood above the noisy racket, he held out the square parcel and nodded. "Pizza. The one with the extra topping is at the bottom." Moistening his lips, he waited for some kind of acknowledgement from his customer. "How much is it, laddie?" The thick Scottish accent of the customer bellowed out towards him. Doing his best to make himself heard without shouting, Cameron smiled. £100 for the extra topping." Avoiding eye contact, he looked down at the floor. He knew it wasn't the usual amount, but it was late, and he was tired. He felt it was worth something extra for coming to this hellhole at this time of night. The barely dressed customer scratched his beard and cocked his head to one side. "That's more than usual, isn't it?" Pausing for an answer, he held out his hands for the pizzas, but Cameron stopped him and stepped back, squeezing the parcel firmly towards him. "It's the delivery charge. Money first, do you want it or not?" Furtively, he looked around to see who was nearby, hoping this wasn't going to be some kind of ambush. It had been known in places like this. "Just give me a second, laddie, and don't be so tetchy. My wallet's through there. I don't keep it in my underwear." The customer laughed, while stressing the point by looking down at his underwear. "Let's not be silly now. You've given your price and I'm prepared to pay it. Just give me the parcel to shut this lot up. I have a lot of hungry people in there waiting to liven up the party with a few extras." He winked and laughed again. Eyeing the jovial Scotsman up and down, it was clear to Cameron he'd had a few drinks. Reluctantly, he decided to hand over the parcel. He didn't want an argument, and given the noise coming from inside, he didn't want a fight on his hands from anyone at the party. Shivering with the cold, he could see his own breath as he spoke. "OK." Rubbing his hands together to keep them warm, and wishing he had kept his gloves on, he stood on the doorstep while the guy disappeared into the flat, leaving the door wide open. Cameron felt he was maybe being overcautious. Surely if this man wasn't going to pay him, he wouldn't have left the door open. It was just this place. It was enough to put anyone's teeth on edge. Once inside, the guy threw the pizzas on the sofa. "I'll just be a minute, laddie," he shouted over the music, to placate the man waiting at the door. Opening the pizza box at the bottom of the pile, a larger-than-normal packet of cocaine, as promised, lay beside a gun. Turning the music up a little louder, the man, nicknamed Jock, hastily looked around and reached for an old discarded T-shirt he had worn earlier in the week. Wrapping the T-shirt around the barrel of the gun, he walked down the hallway. Shaking his head and laughing, he walked closer to Cameron, waving his wallet in the air, his T-shirt wrapped around the gun in the other. "Sorry about that. It was in my trousers in the bathroom. I suppose you want a big tip for climbing those stairs and waiting for me." The man winked and laughed again, putting Cameron at ease. For the first time that night, Cameron smiled. It seemed he had been wrong. Smiling back in the hope of getting a tip as well as what he was creaming off the top from the cocaine he was delivering, he waited for the guy to open his wallet. Quickly raising his gun, Jock dropped his wallet on the floor and grabbed a hold of Cameron's jacket. Pulling him forward, he pressed the gun to his forehead. "We've had enough of you selling your shit and creaming it off the top, making me look bad. You're a dirty, thieving bastard. Just ask your boss, laddie." Panicking and trying to struggle free, Cameron looked both ways down the hallway. There was no one around, and he thought about making a run for it, but when the guy pressed the gun against his forehead, he knew it was too late. "There's no point in shouting, laddie. No one is going to hear you, let alone give a shit." As he fired the gun directly into Cameron's forehead, the T-shirt burst into flames, almost burning his fingers as the kid dropped to his knees and slumped to the floor with his eyes wide open. The bullet had gone straight through Cameron's head, and the blood was minimal, just a hole in his forehead from the bullet to show he was dead. The shot could hardly be heard above the music, but Jock knew that if anyone had heard anything, they wouldn't come out to investigate. They were all safely tucked up in their own homes. Any minute now, someone would be coming to help him get rid of the body, but he wanted to save them the trouble of climbing the stairs to his flat. Lifting the pizza guy up, he dragged him towards the rail of the balcony. The safety rails surrounded all the flats to supposedly stop people from falling over, but in this case, Jock heaved Cameron's limp body up and threw him over the balcony. Instantly he regretted his decision as the sound of a car alarm burst into action, blaring out its horn. He looked over the balcony and saw the flashing lights of the car beneath him in the forecourt, with the dead man lying on his stomach, spread-eagled over the top of it. Trying to think, he scratched his beard and looked around as people opened their front doors, illuminating the blocks of flat from the lights in their hallways, to see what was happening. Shit. This wasn't supposed to happen, Jock thought. The balconies around him seemed to be filling up with people, standing and staring over the railings. When he had been asked to do this job, the idea of getting some free cocaine for a couple of days had appealed to him. But now, in the cold light of day, realization stepped in, and he felt afraid. What was he going to do now? He was supposed to wait for the undertaker's men to come and collect the body. Those had been his instructions. His heart sank, and he knew he was in trouble now. He could hear a woman's voice screaming and echoing around the estate, and running inside, he slammed the door behind him. He needed something to calm his nerves. He knew he had totally fucked up, and the consequences would be fatal. The fear of the police investigating the murder didn't bother him. It was the people who had instructed him to do this job that worried him. They had no mercy, and just as easily as they had instructed him to murder the delivery driver, Someone would be instructed to kill him. The boss, who people knew as the Undertaker, would see that he paid dearly for this calamity. Opening the plastic bag containing the cocaine from the pizza box, he used the handle of a discarded spoon nearby and dipped it inside the bag. Jock sniffed the powder in his nostril and did the likewise with the other. Wincing slightly, he rubbed his nose with the back of his hand. Now he felt better. They had been very generous with the size of the bag they had given him. He had been paid well. The burning sensation in his nostrils made him wince again, with pain this time, and his nose started to bleed. Suddenly his whole face felt as though it was on fire. Feeling lightheaded, he sat down on the sofa to steady himself. His eyes were watering, and he was finding it harder to breathe. Gripping his chest, he lay back on the sofa. A black curtain of unconsciousness overcame him as he closed his eyes.
"Look at my car! There's a dead body on top of it!"
The woman was in floods of tears. Wrapping her dressing gown tighter around her, she ran around the car looking at it.
"Somebody call the police! Do something! Somebody help me! I'm not a well woman!"
she shouted to the crowd. Everyone shifted their feet and turned to look at each other awkwardly. The woman's husband came rushing out towards her, his jaw dropping at the sight before him. Although it was dark, he could see a body sprawled on top of the small Fiat Panda, with one arm hanging aimlessly down the windscreen.
"Is he alive?"
he shouted to the onlookers.
"Has no one had the common sense to call a bloody ambulance? You are there!"
he shouted to a young man standing nearby.
"You're tall. Have a look up there to see if he's breathing." "It's only a fucking panda, not a lorry. If you're so concerned, why don't you have a look?"
the young man shouted back at him. Everyone was shouting to each other and presuming what had happened.
"It looks like he fell off the balcony," somebody shouted. "Yeah, he was probably pissed," somebody shouted back.
As the noise of the crowd escalated, a figure emerged who immediately quietened everyone down.
"Don't worry, you lot."
Finn waved his hands in the air to attract attention. Everyone on the estate knew him and seemed pleased at his intervention. Finn was in his mid-30s. He had turned up at the estate one day to stay at his friend Beanie's for the night while they were having a rave and just never went home. He was the local scrounger and drug dealer and was always hanging around street corners selling whatever he could get his hands on. It was a love-hate relationship between the estate and Finn, which was short for fingers, because he always had his fingers in every pie or in someone's pockets. Finn knew what had happened, but wanted to make some sense of it to this hysterical woman.
"These balconies are a death trap, especially to kids."
He could see that they were all nodding their heads and agreeing with him. They followed his lead and moaned about the tower blocks, which in turn took their minds off the trouble in hand.
"I'll call the police, you lazy bastards,"
he shouted, waving his mobile in the air.
"What's the matter? Don't you want to use your own mobile credit?"
Stepping away from the crowd, Finn dialed a number.
"Daz, it's gone tits up around here. There's a dead body on top of a car. I'm supposed to be calling the police."
There was no answer on the end of the phone, and then the line went dead. Finn realised he'd said enough. Now he had to attend to some damage limitation.
"Did you call them, Finn? What did they say?"
The panic-stricken woman rushed towards him and grabbed his arms, shaking him.
"What's my insurance going to say? I need photos. They won't believe me when I tell them what's happened." "Of course they'll bloody believe you, you stupid cow. There's a dead body in your car and the police are on their way. You'll get a crime number and their report. For fuck's sake, get off my arms. This jacket's designer."
Again the woman burst into tears, waiting for sympathy, but none came. Everyone was as shocked and surprised as she was, enthralled by the whole thing without paying attention to her tantrums. Falling to her knees for effect, she shouted to the crowd again.
"I used that car to get my husband to the hospital for his regular checkup. He's ill, you know, and I've got arthritis."
Holding up her hands to the ever-growing crowd to prove her point, she burst into tears again. Finn rolled his eyes up at the night sky. He was bored now. He was doing his best to pacify everything, but he was running out of things to say.
It'll all get sorted, Mrs. Mac, believe me. As for your husband, he's had that mobility scooter for ages, but I've never seen him use the bastard."
Turning to the crowd, he shouted out,
"Have any of yous lot seen him use it?"
Some started laughing. They knew Mrs. Mac always had something to moan about, especially her lack of money. She knew the benefit system better than the people who worked there.
"When your old man hears the mobile shop hoot its bloody horn, he's like a marathon runner."
Finn was rousing the crowd as best he could. He didn't know what else to do. This had turned into a catastrophe.
"For a bloke with a bad back, you've got 6 kids. It doesn't hurt when he's climbing on top of you, does it?"
Another woman from the crowd shouted. It was becoming mayhem, but Finn was playing for time. Surely Daz would send someone to intervene soon. Mr. Mac then started pointing his finger at the crowd and arguing about their accusations regarding his disabilities. Finn felt better now. At last they were all arguing between each other. His abuse towards Mrs. Mac and her husband had done the trick. There was nothing like a bit of good old shit-stirring to distract the crowd. Mr. Mac held a hand to his lower back, feigning pain.
"Take some photos, love, just as backup. I would, but my back is starting to ache. I think I'll go indoors and have a lie down."
Mr. Mac left his wife and the crowd baying for his blood and went back into their ground-floor flat. Reaching into her dressing-gown pocket, Mrs. Mac took out her mobile phone and took a couple of photos of her car with the dead body on top of it. A nearby woman who had been watching the proceedings put an arm around Mrs. Mac's shoulders to console her. Leaning closer to her ear, she whispered, "I wouldn't do that. Could be bad for your health. Go back inside and have a cup of cocoa with something in it to warm you through. All this will get sorted soon enough." Wiping her tear-stained face with the arm of her soiled dressing-gown, Mrs. Mac turned to the woman beside her, and for a moment both women stared at each other.
"Maybe you're right. It's cold out here, and I'm just a bit shook up by it all. You understand, Maggie?"
"That's the ticket, love. You go and have a nice sit-down, and I will pop you a wee dram around in a minute. It'll make you feel better." Smiling to reassure Mrs. Mac, Maggie soothingly put her arms around the woman's shoulders. Maggie knew everyone would take notice of her. She was one of the estate's longest-standing residents.
"Bloody hell, you lot. Old Mrs. Mac's got a better mobile phone than me. I thought you had no money."
Finn looked at the gathered crowd again in disbelief and shook his head. Scowling, Maggie turned to him.
"Shut it, Finn. Considering Finn stands for fingers, I thought you would have stolen a better one by now. What is your real name anyway? Did your mother give you one, you waste of space?"
she spat out. Finn instantly stopped shouting out. Maggie was a force to be reckoned with, and she had friends in high places, or in very low ones. It depended how you looked at it. Seeing his subdued look, she felt better. Walking Mrs. Mac to her front door and changing her voice, she soothingly patted Mrs. Mac's arm.
"We'll sort it, love. Don't worry. You and your husband get some rest now."
Once Mrs. Mac had taken her advice and gone back into her flat, Maggie walked back up to Finn. She was in her late 50s, skinny, with jet black hair tied in a ponytail to cover the greying roots. The lines around her mouth seemed to encroach even more into her sallow skin as she pouted and poked Finn in the shoulder.
"Shut your mouth and get everyone back into their flats, or I will rip your head off and shit down your neck. You're making things worse."
The glare that followed the sentence sent a chill down Finn's spine. Even though he called her Morticia Adams behind her back, she was a feisty old woman.
"Sorry, Maggie."
Glancing around, Finn suddenly felt embarrassed. Maggie was a real hard case and didn't offer empty threats. He'd seen her hit bigger blokes than him, and he knew she would punch him in front of everyone here, which would ruin his hard man status on the estate if they knew he'd been hit by a woman. Sometimes she really got on his nerves.
"Show's over, folks," Finn shouted. "Police are on their way. Everyone back home and hide your stolen goods before they come knocking.
he laughed, and then turned to Maggie for approval.
"Better leave it to the grown-ups now, Finn," she muttered,
and walked towards her own flat to get the whisky she had promised for Mrs. Mac. Quickly the crowd started to scatter. If the police were on their way, that could mean trouble. The dead man on the top of the car seemed irrelevant now. They'd had their sport for the night. Time for bed, and to make sure that anything that didn't have a receipt was carefully hidden away. Finn's mobile started to ring. Answering it, the instructions on the end were clear. "Go to Jock's flat. I'll call you back." The line went dead again. Why did they want him to go to Jock's flat? That uneasy feeling made his stomach turn somersaults. Waiting until he felt it was safe to go there without being seen, he made his way up the flights of stairs. He hadn't known Jock long, but he was a pain in the arse, always scrounging cocaine, and he owed money everywhere. That was how Finn had heard that Jock was doing some temporary work with the Albanians who ran the pizza place. They had tried selling their stuff on the undertaker's turf, and it had got to the boss man's ears about Jock doing some trading for them on the side. The anonymous man, known as the Undertaker, ruled most of Glasgow. The worst part was that no one knew who he was or what he looked like. It sent chills down Finn's spine, wondering if it was the guy next door or someone he stood at the bar in the pub with. A lot of the drug drop-off points and prostitution rackets were run from local cemeteries. Basically, they were nice, quiet places without too many prying eyes. That is why they nicknamed him the Undertaker. It sounded better than just the boss. He seemed to have eyes and ears everywhere, and no sooner did you step out of line, you ended up paying the consequences. God knows how he found out the most intimate of secrets, but he did, and that was the scariest part of all. Whoever he was someone to be feared. He had no mercy. There was a long chain of dealers, and Finn knew, being a street dealer, he was at the bottom of the pile. They all had their own point of contact to answer to, but that was it. This so-called Undertaker had run this place for nearly 10 years without anyone knowing who he was. The previous bosses had succumbed to horrible torture and even death to get rid of them from his turf while he was taking over. Someone must know him, Finn had thought many times. But they were all keeping their mouths shut, and the thugs and the street soldiers who served out the beatings he ordered were not people to ask or mess with. They were all hardened criminals from around the area who did this mystery man's bidding. That was why Jock had been set up, to make a point to the Albanians that trading on their turf was a big mistake. One of their own was supposed to have been left dead for them to find. Instead, he was lying on top of Mrs. Mac's car. Finn didn't know what he was going to find when he went to the flat, but his gut instinct wasn't good. There was music still coming from inside, so he pushed the door open a little, looking for any sign of life. Taking a deep gulp, he started, tentatively walking down the hallway towards a light that was on in the living room. And that's when he saw Jock's lifeless body. Stunned, he stood there, just looking. Then he started sweating and rubbed his face with his hands. The last thing he wanted was to be found by the police with a dead body. Jock was lying on the sofa, his head at an awkward angle. Finn had seen people unconscious before, but it was pretty clear that Jock was dead. There were bloodstains under his nose, which had now dried, and from what Finn could see, the man had choked on his own vomit. It was all down his shirt and onto the sofa. Seeing him lying there made Finn feel sick himself, and his heart was pounding in his chest. Quickly looking around to see if there was anyone else in the flat, he could see there was no one. But he could see a packet of cocaine beside Jock. Finn was tempted to take a sniff himself, but thought better of it. After all, if it had done that to Jock, what the hell was in it? Instead, Finn looked around for Jock's wallet and found it in the back pocket of the man's jeans. Emptying the contents into his own pocket while consoling himself that Jock wouldn't need the money now and whoever found him first would only do the same thing, he put the empty wallet containing only Jock's driving licence, which informed Finn that Jock's real name was Matthew, back where he'd found it. Turning the music system down so as not to draw attention to the flat, Finn decided it was time to leave. On the way out, he tripped over something and, looking down, saw a gun with a burnt T-shirt lying beside it. Pulling his sleeve down over his hands, he emptied the bullets out of it and then wiped the fingerprints. Shutting the front door behind him, he breathed fresh air into his lungs. Once downstairs, he walked around to the big skips that were at the bottom of the rubbish chute from the flats. Taking the gun, Finn smashed it against the floor again and again, breaking it into pieces. Then he went along to each of the 5 skips and dropped a piece of the broken gun into each of them, along with the T-shirt. Finn's mobile rang just as he was about to go into his own flat. Is he dead? Finn had heard the same cold, calculating voice before, but he knew not to ask questions. Yes, boss. Finn was about to tell him about the gun and the cocaine beside Jock, but decided not to. This wasn't his problem. He'd done more than was expected of him. You've done well, Finn. You will get your reward in heaven. The line went dead again. Finn wasn't sure what they'd meant by that comment, but it gave him the creeps. It felt like someone was watching him. The next morning, when everyone looked out, Mrs. Mack's car had disappeared, and, unknown to the people on the estate, so had the delivery driver's moped, which, in all of the mayhem, no one had noticed. There were no traces of the accident, and it was as though it had never happened. Everyone was surprised that they hadn't heard any police sirens or ambulances, but no one wanted to push it any further. Finn and Maggie both knew this was the job of the undertaker. Finn knew that as soon as he made the call, the chain of authority would pass the message on to the so-called cleaners who would step in to hide any trace of evidence left behind. It would be as though you had dreamt it. These men were professionals who could hide bodies and make people disappear. Maggie knew it would all be tidied away and brushed under the carpet, and had made it her job to put everyone at their ease again and spread the word that they didn't need to send an emergency ambulance because they knew it was a dead body they couldn't save. It all sounded feasible, and no one questioned Maggie. They all agreed that whoever it was had been drunk and had clearly just fallen over the balcony. Thankfully, with all the shouting going on last night, no one had noticed the bullet hole in the man's head. It had also helped that it was dark and he was lying face down on the car, and as much as everyone was being nosy, no one wanted to take a closer look at the corpse. Jock, the annoying druggie whose flat was permanently full of misfits and who always had his music blaring out, much to the annoyance of the estate, apparently had upped sticks and left without a backward look. People were surprised, but not shocked. Whenever he was in rent arrears or owed money, he usually skipped town for a while. Then Maggie popped in to see Mrs. Mack. "How are you, Mrs. Mack? I hope you're feeling better after last night. I wondered, do you still have those photos you took of the accident on your mobile phone?" Maggie pursed her lips as she broached the subject. "Oh, yes, Maggie, and look at this. It looks like the guy who fell had a hole in his head. He must have fallen on something on the way down." Bringing her phone to life, Mrs. Mack showed Maggie the photos. Both women squirmed at the gory sight. Only Maggie breathed a sigh of relief. Thankfully, Mrs. Mack was an idiot. It was obvious to a blind man that it was a bullet hole through his skull. What the hell did she think had happened? "The police haven't been to see me yet. I would have thought they would have been by now. They have taken the car away. How did they do that without the keys?" Mrs. Mack's stupidity surprised Maggie. You only had to ask any 5-year-old on this estate how to unlock a car and it would be done in the blink of an eye. Mrs. Mack put on the kettle and nervously wrung her hands.
Something is wrong. I know it. Why haven't the police been in touch, Maggie?"
No police had been, and no ambulance had picked up that dead man. Maggie hadn't lied when she said she had seen everything. She had indeed been there when the tow truck had taken away the car and the body away. She knew they were going to be crushed. Now Maggie had seen the photos. She had to give the instructions she'd been given to Mrs. Mack. They were incriminating. It was definitely a murder, without a shadow of a doubt.
"Before you do anything, Mrs. Mack, love, you need to do as I say."
Maggie led her to the kitchen table and sat her down. Taking 2 mugs off the hooks, Maggie proceeded to make them both a mug of tea.
"You need to go down to the telephone box on the corner."
Raising her hands, Maggie shook her head as Mrs. Mack tried to interrupt her.
"Don't ask questions, just do as I say. It's for your own good. You know the old telephone box?"
Giving a weak smile, Maggie waited for a response before carrying on. Mrs. Mack was still in her dressing gown. In all of Maggie's years here, she had never seen her wear anything else. Maggie doubted she had done a day's work in her whole life.
"Yes, I know what you mean, but what's that got to do with me?"
Puzzled, Mrs. Mack put 2 teaspoonfuls of sugar in her tea and stirred it.
"If you want all this sorted out, you will do as I say. Go there right now and wait. Don't tell Mr. Mack where you're going, just do as I say."
Pressing the urgency upon her, Maggie stood up. She had delivered the message, and it was up to Mrs. Mack now. As the 2 women looked at each other, Maggie was thankful that the penny seemed to drop at last. After Maggie had left, Mrs. Mack wrapped her dressing gown around her, tightening the belt more securely as she left the flat, and headed for the old telephone box through the estate on the main road. No sooner had she stepped into the old telephone box, she could hear a telephone ringing, but knew it wasn't the one in the box. That hadn't worked for ages. Following the sound, she looked down at the concrete floor and saw a mobile phone lighting up and springing into life. Nervously, she picked it up. The voice on the other end was calm and articulate, giving her instructions. "Leave your mobile phone with the photos you took in the telephone booth. Take the one you're holding with you. It's new. The box on the floor has £50 in it for taxi fares until your car is ready and delivered to your door in 2 days' time. Do not contact the police or your insurance company. Let that be the end of it. If not, I have this number and I know where you live. The other options are not so generous." Then the line on the other end went dead. Mrs. Mack's hands began to tremble, and she looked around, peering out of the dirty glass on the windows, mostly covered with graffiti now. She squinted her eyes to get a better view. There was no one around, apart from the usual passers-by, but no one suspicious, although she knew someone must be watching because the telephone had rung the moment she had stepped into it. She was afraid, but followed the instructions and, leaving her own mobile phone in the telephone box, she picked up the new mobile phone and the box containing the money, opened the door, and left. As promised, 2 days later, when she got up in the morning and opened the curtains, a car was parked outside her ground-floor flat. A gasp of astonishment left her lips. It looked as good as new. Looking even closer at it, she realized it was new and was even better than the one she had owned before, although it was the same color and model. Beads of sweat appeared on Mrs. Mack's forehead as she stared at it. Going to inspect it, she saw the keys had been put through her letterbox. She picked them up and went outside to take a better look. A cold shiver ran down her spine, and she looked up at the flats to see Maggie standing there with her arms crossed, watching her. Both women exchanged glances, and then went back inside their own homes. The matter was over. The problems were solved. Finn had kept a close watch on Jock's flat. He saw us skip outside on the forecourt with council workers throwing his furniture in it. Finn wasn't sure if they were real council workers or not. Just because they wore those luminous jackets and overalls didn't mean a thing around here. All he knew was that the word was being spread that Jock had gone to Edinburgh, and so nobody thought any more of it. The matter was over, dead and buried, you might say. Chapter 2. Going Straight. The grey, high-rise tower blocks, standing side by side, seemed to block out the sun and cast a shadow over the estate. The washing blowing on the makeshift washing lines on the balconies of the flats created strange shapes and patterns on the pavements, almost like monsters. This estate was a city of its own in the heart of the East End of Glasgow, and the people who lived there had their own language and lived by their own rules. It was known particularly to the police and outsiders for its drug dealers and crime. This was Legoland. Floor on top of floor of flats squared on top of each other. Nothing here worked properly, and no one from the council would come to fix them. The old tenements opposite them did nothing to brighten the place up, and buses never went past the end of the road after 5 p.m. Taxis refused to go there in case they got mugged. This was Steve's home, and it was all he had ever known. Walking in front of the tower blocks and tenements, shouts and laughter rang out from the broken windows of a car shattered by fire. Steve raised his eyebrows and cocked his head to one side to get a better view. Bending down, he looked inside the burnt-out Fiesta. 3 kids were playing in it, pretending to be racing drivers. He'd done it himself once upon a time, which brought a half-smile to his face. Nothing had changed in the last 3 years since he had been in prison. "Go on, piss off, you'll hurt yourselves," he shouted.
"Fuck you, mister,"
the eldest boy of the 3 shouted. He was sitting behind the steering wheel, pretending to drive. He was around 10 or 11, and raised his middle finger at Steve.
"What's your name?"
Steve shouted through their noise.
"What's it got to do with you, mister?"
Again the stubborn boy, who was trying his hardest to act tough in front of his younger mates, glared at him.
"This burnt-out car could blow up and cause you harm. Just listen to me, eh, laddie? Go and play somewhere else and don't use that tone with me, you little shit. I'm looking out for you." "Don't bother. My dad does that."
There was his answer. Rolling his eyes up to the sky, Steve looked up at the tower block in front of him. As it met the sky, he searched the windows and balconies for his home, but everything looked the same, and he wasn't sure which was his. It was obvious the charred remains of the car held much more interest for the boys than what he had to say, and shrugging at their comments, he stood up straight and walked towards the centre of the estate, clutching his few belongings in a plastic bag with the HMP emblem stamped on the front of it. It didn't seem a lot for a lifetime, but it was all he had.
"Oi, Stevie, is that you?"
The echoing shout from above surprised him, and he scanned the balconies again to see who it was.
"Over here, you moron!"
Finn, his old friend, shouted again. A smile crossed Steve's face. Seeing his old friend jumping up and down, waving both arms in the air to attract his attention, made him feel better. Waving back, he cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted back, "What floor are you on?" Finn was always in someone else's flat, especially if there was free food or drugs available. It was always sensible to ask where he was before you started the long walk up the stairs.
15, but the lift isn't working. Come up, some of the lads are here, come and have a few beers."
As Steve looked up, he saw some other friends of Finn come out and join him in the balcony. They had all been at school together, but that seemed like a very long time ago now. Steve had served 3 years for possessing a firearm and dealing drugs, and Finn and the men with him that night had walked away scot-free. Finn had been under orders to help set him up. He knew that now, but time and again he wished Finn had tipped him off in some way, considering they were old school friends, but it was obviously a chance Finn wasn't prepared to take. But the man who ran all the operations in Glasgow had been severely pissed off with him, and he would have made Finn pay for it too. It was survival of the fittest, and the last thing Steve wanted was the blood of his friend on his conscience. Everyone saved their own skin so they could live to deal another day. He had been a dealer, He wasn't bitter. They all took that chance and knew to keep their mouths shut. The man they called the Undertaker ran this whole estate and beyond. This was his turf, and everyone knew he'd killed more people than cancer. No one knew the man's real name, and to be honest, it was for the best they didn't. Traipsing up the stairs was taking its toll. He'd done his best to keep fit in prison, but now he was challenged by 100 stone steps. The steel door that was left wide open for him was nothing new. All drug dealers had steel doors with a hatch in the middle where they handed out their drugs and took the money. It was supposedly to hide their faces, but the main reason was to stop people kicking the door in or shooting at it, which was a frequent occurrence and an occupational hazard. The ambush by his friends was a welcome home indeed for Steve. They shook their cans of lager and opened them, spraying the fizzy drink over his head. "Here, you can have this one to drink." They were all laughing and patting each other on the back. "How was it, Steve? Shit place, that prison. Been there myself a couple of times. Everything okay? We solid?" Finn frowned as he spoke the words. His voice was low in front of his friends, but he knew Steve would know what he meant. He wanted to know if he had said anything and if there was any bitterness between them. Pushing back his wet, lager-stained hair, Steve shook his head. "Everything's okay, Finn. It's over now. Mates." Holding out his hand, he shook Finn's. "Good one, because I knew you were coming out sometime this week and I've a job lined up for you. If we'd known the exact date, we could have lined up a couple of willing lasses to give you a proper welcome home. Don't suppose that dick of yours has seen much excitement lately, apart from your hand, has it?" Everyone laughed, and Steve felt like one of the boys again, part of the gang. A couple of men Steve didn't recognise were sitting in a corner, spaced out from the drugs. They had smoked roll-ups for so long, their fingers were yellow with the stain of nicotine. Steve guessed there was more than tobacco in the roll-ups. It was definitely some form of weed. It smelled like an opium den in here. "I've only just got out, Finn. What do you mean you have a job for me? Doing what?" "I have to see my probation officer on Monday, and I'm keeping my nose clean while I'm wearing this tag." Rolling up his trouser leg, Steve showed them his ankle tag. He was also under curfew, which would restrict his activities day and night and give his whereabouts to the authorities. Steve's heart sank. He did need a job, but he wanted more than this. He had served his last prison sentence. He wanted more for his family now. It was just this estate. It was like quicksand. No matter how hard you fought, it kept dragging you back in. Steve wanted no part of it now. He was older and wiser and wanted to lead a proper life with normal people. That is, if Sheila, his wife, would keep her promise and give him a final chance at their marriage. With only a Celtic flag pinned across the windows to block out the light, and a faded, mottled sofa with the sponge coming out of the rips in the arms that had probably come out of a skip somewhere, Steve suddenly saw the place for what it was. He'd spent all of his life here, and this flat was the place to be, but suddenly it had lost its grandeur. The small wooden coffee table in front of them all still had traces of the lines of cocaine they had been sniffing. Their pupils were enlarged, and they were rambling on. This had been paradise once, and he had been just the same. He just hadn't seen what the rest of the world saw. It suddenly dawned on him how much he'd changed. He'd given up the drugs, even when they were offered in prison. Maybe, he thought, he had just grown up. Football was an important part of the estate. You were either blue or green, and God help anyone who went into the wrong part of the stadium at a match. There had been wars over the colours of the shirts. You were either Celtic or Rangers. There was no in-between. In answer to his question, excitedly, they all shouted at once, "To pizzas!" raising their cans in the air like some kind of salute. Steve looked on. This was weird. "We're all working at the kebab and pizza shops around the area. One's on the main road. All up front and legitimate." Finn turned to his friends and they nodded at each other seriously, then burst out laughing. "On the face of it, Stevie, everything is above board.
The boss has bought quite a few shops around here. Let's be honest, they were all derelict shitholes. But it makes life easy to sell the gear. It definitely beats standing around in the rain." Finn laughed. "The delivery guys on their mopeds and the shops are all legitimate, but you can sell some gear on the side and make it worth your while. That's what you need to do, Steve. Get a legitimate job to keep your probation officer happy and off your back. And pizza as it is, Stevie. The rest is easy peasy." Finn turned to each of his friends and gave them a high five. Their spirits were high, as though the world couldn't touch them. Sighing, Steve remembered when he had felt that way once. It seemed weird, but prison had opened his eyes. He'd seen the world for what it was. He had too much to lose this time around. In his last letter to his wife Sheila, he had promised to go straight. She had said this was his last chance, or she was moving away and taking his 2 kids with her. He wanted them out of this shithole too, but preferably with himself alongside them. He owed Sheila that. She had stood by him all this time. He knew who they meant by the boss, and instantly he felt the bile rise in his throat. They all spoke as though they knew this so-called gangland boss known as the Undertaker, but no one did. The mystery was part of the fear he instilled in them. Everyone knew all of the orders came from above via messages left at the cemeteries or mobile phones, different levels of decision-makers doing this man's dirty work. He had fingers in every pie and resorted to regular beatings to keep them on their toes. Some people had even wondered if it was a woman. That was the whole point. No one knew. That was what made him so deadly. No one could sweet-talk their way out of a beating or charm their way up the promotion ladder. The Undertaker wasn't interested. All he wanted was his money, although in fairness he paid a good wage for your services, which is why the majority followed order. When you were told your money would be there, it always was. Shaking his head, Steve tried his best to wriggle out of Finn's proposal. "Nah, I don't think so. I think my probation officer already has a job lined up for me. They said as much." Steve was trying to be polite while refusing their offer, and he drank back his lager and stood up. But Finn and his friends just burst out laughing again. They were high on drugs and alcohol, and there was no point in trying to make sense out of their garbled conversation. This was beginning to get on Steve's nerves. "Steve, we know you, you daft bugger. We've sorted the job for you. You're to start at the pizza shop on Monday. Nice and early now." Again, they all thought it was hilarious as they laughed and slapped each other on the back. Shocked, Steve sat back down again. Narrowing his eyes in confusion, he asked, "What do you mean? You've sorted it? You mean you've set me up again?" Watching the smiles drain from their faces, Steve was glad they knew what he meant. "For God's sake, Finn, I've just done 3 years in prison because you helped set me up for robbery. You didn't have the balls to tell me what plans your boss had in store for me, and now you're handing me to them on a plate again. Will you never learn, you fucking Judas?" Angry and upset, Steve couldn't believe his ears. He'd only been out of prison a few hours, and yet his fate was already decided. Steve, the fall guy, again. "No, Steve, I wouldn't do that. This was the Undertaker's idea. Maybe he feels he owes you. I thought you'd be pleased." Stammering, Finn looked down at the floor. "I thought you said there was no bad feeling between us, that we were good." Sighing and rolling his eyes up at the nicotine-stained ceiling, Steve nodded his head. "So, what has he got planned for me this time? He won't be happy, Finn, until I'm pushing up daisies. No wonder they call him the fucking Undertaker. We are mates. I owe you a lot. You gave me a job dealing with you and drugs when I was an addict, but I don't see it the way you do. That bloody phantom you call the Undertaker doesn't think he owes me anything. No offence, Finn, but I don't intend going back to prison. Sheila will wash her hands of me. I'm not prepared for that. It's a legitimate job, Steve. Go and see for yourself. There is money to be made on the side, but if you don't want to, that's your business. It's a job, mate, Finn pleaded. He was the one who felt he owed Steve. He had pleaded to get Steve this job at the pizza shop. It was where a lot of the drugs were sold. Each pizza had its own special price topping, and the addicts knew what they were. It's a regular wage for Sheila and the kids. What else are they going to find for an ex-con like you? For fuck's sake, Steve, unless you have a winning lottery ticket in your pocket, you're fucked. Although Steve could see Finn's reasoning, he was still unsure. It was a job and a regular wage, and Sheila would be pleased about that. Surely that would give her some hope that he was going straight and trying to start afresh. And what job would his probation officer find him? What was there for a man in his 30s with a criminal record? Steve knew Finn was right, but he didn't want to admit it. Taking an even bigger sigh, he nodded his head and gave a weak smile. "Okay, Finn. Thanks. I'll take the job, but I want no part of any other dealings. Okay with you?" Sheepishly, Finn looked at his friends. "Yeah, sure, Steve, whatever you say. Come on, it'll be a laugh, and you'll get fed as well. You look like you need a few good pizzas inside you. Fatten you up a little like Beanie here. He eats more than he sells." The tense atmosphere disappeared as they all burst out laughing again. Steve still had his reservations. His friends seemed to think this was a great adventure, but he couldn't make his mind up whether they were stupid or so off their heads on drugs that they couldn't see the woods for the trees. He'd already been caught dealing and taken the rap for it. Now he knew it had all been a set-up. Night after night, he'd gone over it in his mind. He'd upset the undertaker by not shooting another drug dealer on his turf. But it had been a young kid, and Steve hadn't seen the point in killing him. The kid hadn't been to blame. All the main dealers used kids to stand on the same street corners or park benches for hours on end. Kids couldn't be prosecuted, and they were cheap labour. The biggest factor was that they were so terrified by the street dealers they wouldn't dare say anything. For a day's work, they would maybe get £10 or £20, and they thought they were millionaires. When it had come to the attention of the undertaker's street dealers that others were dealing on his turf, he had wanted his competition killed as a warning. But when Steve had seen the kid riding his bike round and round on the corner, he knew he couldn't do it. He was only around 10 years old, and Steve was no kid killer. Instead, Steve had threatened and frightened the young boy. He'd taken his bag of drugs and money and felt that was enough. But only seconds later he heard the engine of a car start up, the street dealers in charge of the young kids who were always watching. Steve had run as fast as possible down side alleys to escape his pursuers, who not only chased him but were shooting at him too. Thankfully their cars couldn't get to him, but he heard the screech of the car and then the doors bang. They were going to chase him on foot. Seeing a back window of a house open, he had climbed inside and fallen into the kitchen, banging his head on the sink. A woman screamed when she saw him, but he put his hand over her mouth and told her to be quiet. She had nodded, and he had headed for the front door. In the wake of further screams from the woman, this had given him time to escape. Now, 3 years on, he realised it hadn't been enough to please the undertaker. Whoever he was had not been pleased when it was reported back that he hadn't killed the young kid. The only appeasement was the bag of drugs, and, of course, the money he'd taken from the kid. Steve had helped himself to some of it, but had decided to hand the rest over. He'd taken one hell of a beating for his lack of judgment. He couldn't remember how many men had ambushed him that night, but he could remember the pain. His jaw had been broken, and he thought that was the end of it, but it wasn't, much to his regret. Next, he'd been ordered to do a raid on the house of a well-known drug dealer in Edinburgh. It was some rich guy's house, full of cocaine and whatever else you could get your hands on. He, Finn, and these two friends sitting before him had agreed to do it. They had been tooled up with guns, which was the usual thing.
To be a dealer in Glasgow, you needed a gun, just in case. After donning balaclavas, they had watched from the car they had stolen for the man and his wife to leave the house so it would be empty. Once they had broken in, they had separated into different rooms and ransacked the place. But no matter how hard they searched, behind skirting boards, false walls, the webbing underneath the sofas, there were no drugs to be found. Absolutely nothing. Instead, 2 police cars pulled up, followed by the police banging and shouting at the door. They had driven up to the house without their sirens, purposely giving no warning. They had been tipped off, that was for sure. When the police had handcuffed him, Steve had been surprised to hear them report that there was no one else in the house. Finn and his friends had fled, leaving him to face the music alone. He'd been arrested for possession of a gun, breaking and entry, and he had filled his pockets with jewellery and money he had found in the bedroom. On top of that, there had been the cocaine he'd found in the inside pocket of his jacket. Steve never used cocaine, and he certainly hadn't put it there, and he knew right then that this was a setup, and he had walked straight into it. When they checked the car outside and found it was stolen, he was charged with that as well. Steve had just shrugged and accepted his fate. There was nothing else to do. But to make things worse, he found out that someone had shot the young kid on the corner anyway. It had all been pointless. But at least Steve didn't have that on his conscience. He didn't blame them, he blamed himself. Only he had got himself into this situation. The undertaker was pure evil. This faceless man had no conscience. Kill or be killed, and he didn't care who got hurt. He never seemed to get his hands dirty. He paid everyone else to make him rich. When Steve's case had gone to court, he had entered a guilty plea and kept his mouth shut about his friends. But facing Sheila had been the worst. The look of disappointment on her face when she had visited tortured him. To make things worse, she had brought the kids too. Who would want their kids visiting them in prison? Sheila had made her point. This was his last chance. Now, 3 years on, with a tag on his ankle, he listened to Finn and his friends telling him of their good fortune, while his mind wandered. It was time to leave. He'd heard enough. It was time to face the music and see Sheila. Part of him felt pleased that he could tell her he had a job, although his heart sank. He couldn't go backwards. He just couldn't. "I've got to go, lads. It's been great catching up." Standing up, he shook their hands, in turn. Finn held on to his hand a little longer. "No hard feelings, Steve. I'm sorry, man." Reaching out, Steve hugged him to reassure him. He knew Finn had been threatened to do this. Everyone knew and heard about the undertaker's tortures. It made even the hardest of men wince. It was said that if you ever met the undertaker, that would be the last time you saw daylight. It was a death sentence. Although many nights Steve had lain on his bunk bed and vowed he would find this mystery man, he had imagined what he looked like. Small, pathetic, balding, or tall and fat. He had probably passed him in the street 1,000,000 times.